On today's Locked On Jayhawks bonus episode, the pieces don't seem to fit for this KU basketball roster. What can be done about it? Why is it happening? Should they hire a GM moving forward?
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on? Derek Johnson here. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for making it your first listen every day. Thank you to everydayers catching each and every show. You can find us on our YouTube page or anywhere that you get your podcast on the audio side of things. We got a bonus episode coming at you today talking about the pieces not really fitting for KU basketball, and I think a very interesting quote that was given from one Mr. Bill Self after the Iowa State game that we're going to get into. And you know, what could have gone differently for KU in the offseason, as well as does this team need to hire a general manager? You've seen some schools around the country do that. So we'll get into that on today's bonus episode of the show. Let's start right here with what was said by Bill Self in the postgame of Iowa State. You might have seen this already on social media because it was kind of making the rounds after the game, but he was actually talking about Iowa State, and he was complimentary of what the Cyclones and TJ Otzelberger had done. He said, quote, "I think that their evaluation recruiting has been tremendous." He goes on to say later, "The bottom line is that the pieces fit." And of course, it could just be about Iowa State, but it's really hard not to take that stuff as, especially given like KU's problems and everything we see on the court. It was hard not to see that as he's not just saying that the pieces fit of Iowa State, but kind of saying like, sometimes your pieces don't fit. That was kind of the unsaid part. Like sometimes you put together good talent and the pieces don't fit. And it felt like that was kind of directed at like, that's us. Like right now, the pieces just don't fit, right? It's hard not to take this as not just the Iowa State compliment, but also a reflection of him on the KU roster. And, it is one of those things where it's like I think you should leave like the meme and the scene, the skit where it's just like, we're all trying to find the guy who did this. And it's like, well, you put together the roster. So, that is kind of part of it. But there's just a lot of things about this team that don't fit together. Like the KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson pairing, it just doesn't fit. I think you can make it work with one of the two. It would just not like, if you had KJ Adams being the one, I think you would just have to lean into being more of a team that, okay, you're going to play KJ 20 minutes at 5, you're going to play Flory 20 minutes at 5 and be a super switchable defensive team. Versus if your team just had Hunter, you would try to build into that about being, how can we insulate him on the defensive end, and then can we just put a bunch of shooters around him on the offensive end, right? You could, I think, make either of those rosters work. I think you could make a roster with KJ Adams work. I think you could make a roster with Hunter Dickinson work. But I don't think you can make it work with both of them on the roster. And when I say make it work, like, what are we talking about here? Kansas is still like, a top 10 team in the country. Like, they're still a good team, but they're not a great team. They're not an elite team. And that is, for better or worse, how things are judged when you were Kansas basketball and you were judged at this high level. So, yeah, of course they could still, make a Sweet 16 and get a 3 or a 4 seed in the NCAA tournament. Sure. And for a lot of other schools, that would be like a dream season or a great season to have. But it's just different when you're at Kansas, right? So that's part of it. And, AJ Storr just hasn't really fit in anywhere. And this is one where, maybe this one gets a little bit revisionist. I know some people still want to see him given more opportunity, get more leeway, but I don't know. I continue to look at some of the numbers and see the play, and I'm like, I don't know. Like, you're starting to get to a point where it's just like, it's going to be kind of just ready to like cut it off, and you're going to have to narrow down the rotation and everything. And when you look at AJ Storr, the best part about him is he's somebody who can make shots happen with the ball in his hand, but that's not happening as much at Kansas. And he hasn't been a good enough rebounder or defender to play the 4 for you, which I think would be the ideal world. That, if he was playing more minutes at the 4, maybe that would mean less minutes of the KJ Hunter pairing where KJ's playing the 4, right? And he hasn't been able to shoot it or hit shots well enough to be in there, I guess you would say, over like Rylan Griffin or, maybe Shaquille Moore as being kind of that third player in there at kind of the guard position. So this is one of those where it felt like kind of one of those big mistakes. Imagine if you went for fit as opposed to talent, right? If you just go for the top end talent every time, you could end up with Hunter Dickinson and AJ Storr and these players who were all Big Ten at previous stops, but it's not always going to fit, right? Imagine if you would have said, hey, instead of AJ Storr, let's go get Kobe Brea, who is like a 50% 3-point shooter at Kentucky, right? And he was coming from Dayton. And I don't know, maybe he would have picked Kentucky anyway, but we don't need to get into that. But like point being, it just, there hasn't been the fit there for that. And then with DeJuan Harris, I don't think he fits as well with a team that needs offense. Clearly right now, Kansas needs offense more than they need defense. And so if you had a team like I don't even know, next year, I think DeJuan Harris would be a great fit to play next to Darren Peterson. Obviously that can't happen, but because then you would have more of a ball handling type, can facilitate and set up for Peterson and take more of the defensive, mantle. With this team, because there isn't enough offense, you're asking DeJuan to do more than, he is on the offensive end of the court. And so that's not a great fit for it either, right? Bill Self probably hasn't allowed Rylan Griffin to fit in enough. That's probably a little bit on that. And I mean, for goodness sake, like one of the team's best lineups has been the lineup where they're playing Flory Badunga next to Hunter Dickinson, which like blows my mind that even works in today's day and age of college basketball, but it has. And they've kind of been forced into playing it because of lack of production. But also at the same point in time, part of me is just like, even though I don't understand why it works in today's day and age of college basketball, I'm like, they should play it more because it is working more than some other lineups. And so I think on their own, KU has some good players. I think Bill Self is still an outstanding basketball coach, but they're not overly talented either. Like when you look at NBA draft boards, for instance, you're not seeing a bunch of KU players pop up in the top 100 or the top 60 or whatever it is. Honestly, though, you're not really seeing that with Iowa State either. You're not seeing like Iowa State have projected first round picks or lottery picks or anything like that. But guess what? Iowa State's pieces fit a lot better. And so I think you're seeing the result right now. Kansas is not a good offense. They don't take or make threes. They shoot lots of mid-range shots and push shots. They don't get to the free throw line. Those are all bad things in today's day and age of modern hoops, I guess you could say. And it's not just that like Iowa State has recruited to fit in that way. Like I mentioned Kentucky for Kobe Bryant. Mark Pope this year recruited for fit. They didn't go out and get like all of the very best transfer portal players. They recruited for fit. Look at how like Houston and Tennessee build their identity. And then like in the case of Houston, you added that one perimeter score in LJ Cryer. In the case of Tennessee, you added that one perimeter score in Dalton Connect last year. And I'm blanking on the kid's name this year who's been awesome for them, but whatever. Point being, you have to recruit in the portal, I think, for fit more than you do for star power. And I think that's kind of part of this, of why the roster isn't fitting right now for KU. All right, let's get into an interesting hypothetical from the offseason and also pose the question, should Kansas hire a general manager? Our episode of the show, bonus episode here, is brought to you by Prize Picks, the place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings, Prize Picks has changed the game in daily fantasy sports. Whether it's the playoffs or the regular season, Prize Picks has made it easier than ever to win big while enjoying all the football action. Now it's playoff time, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with Prize Picks. Here's how it works. You simply pick more or less, easy enough, on at least two players. And if your picks hit, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. Yes, that's right. 1,000 times your money just by making a few simple picks. This week on Prize Picks, you can get Lamar Jackson, more than 250 passing yards, Travis Kelce, more than 70 receiving yards, or less if you think it'll be less than that. It's fun to predict and easy to play. Plus, with Prize Picks Flex Play, you can still double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. And with the app, you can get your winnings fast, sometimes in as little as 15 minutes. Ready to run your game this football season? Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 just for playing. Don't wait. Take your game to the next level with Prize Picks. Prize Picks, run your game. All right, continuing on to this bonus episode of the show. One thing I am curious about is what would have happened this offseason if KU would have held on to Riley Kugel. Now, I don't think this was a situation where like KU bungled it or something. I think they wanted Riley Kugel. Riley Kugel wanted to come to KU, but it doesn't seem like it just worked from like a transferring of credits and making that stuff work over. So he ends up going to Mississippi State. And I just find this interesting because, I look at it and Kugel's playing 20 minutes a game for what has been a very good Mississippi State team so far this season. But, that was one big question with Kugel coming in. It was like, okay, he got into some headbutts maybe with the previous coach that he was having to come off the bench and played a smaller role than you might expect. But it seems like he's accepted that at Mississippi State, which makes me think he would have accepted that at Kansas, obviously. But he's been averaging, these numbers don't jump off the page necessarily. They're solid, but 9.6 points per game, 2.9 rebounds. He is shooting 47% from the floor. He is shooting 32% from three-point range, 74% at the foul line. Like, those are solid numbers for Kugel. And so it's interesting if you go back and say, what if they never got Storr and had Kugel instead? Because those numbers, even though they're, not jump off the page worthy, they're solid. They're better than what Storr is doing right now. Now, there's no guarantee it would have worked at Kansas and that Bill Self would give him as long of a leash as he had, right? There's no guarantee in how all that kind of works together. But I do wonder, and maybe that wasn't even part of it. Maybe it's if they still had Riley Kugel, like they just never get Diggy Coit. And I think that would clearly be an upgrade in terms of what you had there. So I think that's certainly an interesting one when looking back on it and wondering kind of about the offseason. But it really does feel like the second straight year where you can point to other portal targets that maybe they had visit, other portal targets that maybe you had interest in that they just didn't really go for or picked somebody else or that they picked over somebody else, right? And there's so many domino effects that you can just be like, man, what if they wouldn't have taken Nick Timberlake and would have ended up with, at that point, maybe they would have been in the running for Cam Spencer or, with Harrison Ingram last year or with Kobe Brea this year. There's so many where it's just like, and that's kind of the nature of the business. But yeah, it's just unfortunate. So does KU need a GM? We'll discuss that next. This episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL playoffs are almost here, but it's not too late to get in on the regular season action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can finish the season strong with $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. FanDuel has so many ways for you to pick up a W. I love betting on which players score a touchdown. You can get first touchdown, anytime touchdown, and there's so many ways for you to pick up that dub. It's thrilling. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your chance at $250 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, continuing on, finishing up on this bonus episode, don't forget to check out our Kansas State preview, which we had out as well here on Locked On Jayhawks. So what lessons should this teach moving forward for KU? And I do feel like we're maybe dumbly, like it almost feels like we're giving a funeral to this season. And I don't mean that to come across. It's just clearly there's problems right now for KU. Could they turn it around? Absolutely, right? Is there still time in the season? Yes, of course there is, right? Is the tournament weird and crazy things can happen? Yes, to all of those things. Those are all very true. But it definitely feels like, they just haven't been as good these last, year and a half, 2 years from where they were or where your expectations are or where Bill Self raised the expectations of this program. So what lessons should this teach moving forward? For me, number one is hiring a general manager, because I think this is akin, like, you see this all the time, I think, in the NFL, especially head coaches who also are like the general manager for their team. And maybe they run into an issue with the personnel. We saw with Bill O'Brien, who was constantly making the playoffs with the Texans, but then kind of, got in his own way from a personnel perspective, ends up getting fired. Andy Reid, when he was with the Philadelphia Eagles, he was calling the shots from the personnel perspective, right? He ends up getting fired, not because he's a bad coach, but maybe because his personnel decisions didn't give him the best opportunity to be the best coach that he could. Now he goes to Kansas City, and of course he still has his hand in personnel decisions, but they have a GM in Brett Veach, right? So you think about those things, and I mean, heck, even Bill Belichick with the Patriots, like that's kind of what happened there, right? Sometimes you need to step back and say, okay, maybe I just need to be coaching here and not the one who's handling all the NIL, dealing with the agents, picking what players to go for. Maybe it would be better, because think about it, like during the season, how much can Bill Self really be scouring the transfer portal, right? How much can Bill Self be scouting other teams that are outside the league or outside of their schedule and really be paying attention to who the best players in those situations are, right? It's just like a time management thing, right? He watches other basketball games, of course, but like KU football has guys who are designated as like doing that, right? You know what I mean? So that when they hit the portal, it's not just, okay, let's catch up on the film. A lot of times they're prepared. They've already watched the film on the kid, right? And so I think that would be very beneficial for KU. And like so much like Duke has a general manager. I think it would be very good for KU if they were able to go out and get a general manager. I think beyond that, I do think when I look at the 2025 to 26 roster, I think they do have an awesome base. I believe in Darren Peterson being an absolute dude next season, right? I mean, obviously the recruiting ranking would signify I'm not going out on a limb saying that, but we do see sometimes freshmen who are ranked highly that come in and they have high expectations and they don't totally live up to them, or they're just solid players, but they're not great. I am a believer that Darren Peterson is going to come in and be like a great player in college basketball next season. And so if you believe that, if you're Bill Self and you believe that, then you need to operate in the portal next offseason as building around him, as opposed to like don't go out there and get another AJ Storr who is a, point scoring. Like AJ Storr would be better on a team if he had to be their number one scoring option. You know what I mean? You don't need to do that. Find complementary pieces. Find the shooter to play with Darren Peterson. Find the ball handler to get him the ball and play good defense. Right? You know what I mean? Find those things. But I look at that. I look at Floyd Badunga possibly back in year 2 as being a guy who I think could very much end up being like Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year in year 2 at Kansas. Like, I like some of the other freshman recruits that they have coming in terms of the length and the wingspan that they're going to be bringing to the table. I would love if they can get Rylan Griffin back for another year and have his floor spacing next to Darren Peterson. Raquise Passmore hasn't done a ton this year, but I still think he's going to take a big growth in year 2. So, I like the base they have for next year, but I'm worried that, are they going to overdo it in the portal and bring on just whatever the absolute star of the portal is that overshadows other stuff, instead of just going for the best fit. So I think those need to be the lessons from this. Hire a GM, look for fit out of the transfer portal, out of just the pure best talent, and trying to make it work after that, because it's a little bit harder to do that, especially when a lot of these players, already have a history, already have time at other colleges, that it's probably a little bit harder to kind of break them down and get them to do exactly what you want. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. Don't forget to check out our Kansas State preview as well, and see you for a recap of that. Probably be out on late Saturday night, early Sunday morning. See you then.